Thank you very much, Rudy. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been invited to take you on a virtual tour of Middelburg this afternoon. And I'm building this on what Andele said about space. And look at the space that I'm going to show you and keep in mind what Andele has presented to you earlier today. The second part of this is that I try and integrate the different aspects of heritage, the historical aspects, as well as some emotional aspects in communicating the heritage, with the purpose of it being accessible to the general public. So, what I'm presenting to you is a concept that can be used to communicate heritage to the general public in smaller towns, smaller communities where you are from and what you are representing here these 4 days. I know there's far more advanced technology available than what I'm going to show you here. But we tried in this presentation and in this approach to stick to what basic IT capability there is in Wakkerstroom and in Dolstroom to be able to communicate this. The colleagues from Johannesburg, yes, you can fly up and down and things like that, but for the smaller communities, let's stick to the basics and try and address options. In this approach, we're using technology to try and share unique photographs with general public, people interested in heritage, about the different aspects of the heritage. And that is what I'm going to take you through this afternoon. So, some of the stuff you may have seen today, and some of the stuff you're going to see again tomorrow when Carol Hardeiser presents his presentation. But let's take you on a virtual tour through the history of Middelburg and try and expose you to some aspects of the history. That is Middelburg in 2025. Now let's try and see what it looks like previously. Let's go back into history and look into the history of Middelburg in a gateway to the past. This virtual tour is presented to you not chronologically, but geographically, so it's not necessarily in a sequence. And I acknowledge the pictures that we are using from various colleagues that made their pictures available to us. The challenge with this is we always sing the song and say that we will remember the heritage and we will remember the Old Lang Syne, but unfortunately, of the Old Lang Syne and what we are talking about in this presentation, there's unfortunately very little left. So we try to expose you to this and share with you a little bit of the heritage of Middelburg. Now, Middelburg, as you have already heard from previous speakers, started as a church town. In 1864, the Dutch Reformed Church bought the farm. They started the town and they ran the town by the church. So you will see that a lot of the stuff, including the center of town that Andele referred to earlier, was laid out by the church, and there was very clear preconditions stated by the church on the use of this. In 1866, they contracted a very interesting person by the name of Theo and he moved into the town and was appointed to measure up the town. Now, Theodor Root had no experience in measuring out towns or geographical structures, or he wasn't a student from Mandela, I can assure you, but he tried his best to mark out the town and establish a basic layout for the town. He was the first resident in town, and Merenskis describe him that he was staying in a little mud hut in town and was selling stands in this new town. He was also the father of the first European girl born here in Middelburg. In 1890, the church decided to build a new church. And this became the center of the town. And it's this center of the town that was the center of the activities that we will use today for our virtual tour. The well-known Witkerk, or White Church of Middelburg, is a symbol of the town for many, many years. And yes, it is still there, and it's still standing, and we'll have the privilege to visit it this evening, and you can walk through the church and see what it looks like. But this church has got a very unique feature, and luckily the church allowed us to utilize this feature to bring you the virtual tour of Middelburg. They allowed us to climb up the stairs into the tower of the church as it stands at the moment. I will not recommend that to the ladies this evening. There may be a few gentlemen at the bottom interested in looking upwards, but those stairs are well woven. But on the top, there's a clockwork. And that is the original clockwork of the church. And that was bought from Germany by the missionaries from Boccabello and imported into the town. And we looked at this clockwork and we thought, maybe if we switch over that lever right there and turn it in reverse, may we be able to go back in history and look like what it looks like before in Middelburg. So luckily, the clock ran backwards, and we were able to utilize the tower of the White Church and look through these amazing time windows that are positioned around the tower. And it is from these windows that we could look back at the history of the center of Middelburg from this church built in 1890 as previously indicated. Now those windows are unique, that if you look through them and the clock runs backwards, you could see into history. And that was our advantage. So we peeped through the first window and we looked into that direction, into the town. And this is what we saw. A shopping mall. Professor Franz Johan referred to the Wimpy. There it is, sir, right there, available to you. And that site is a very unique site in Middelburg. If we then use that window and look backwards, this is what we see on that same site. The rectory of the church, built also just in 1890 to accommodate the new appointed pastor of the church, and he stayed in this house for a substantial period of time. That's what the house looked like, and very interestingly, he called this house Hardewil. Now, for the Afrikaans and English people, this was a hard living. And old Dominee Burger that moved into this house in 1884 had a hard life right here. And that is his rectory where he stayed and operated in Middelburg. When he looked from there at the church, this is what they see every day. A little bit of a side view of this church. Now, who stayed in this house? Two very interesting people. Dominee Allewynburger and his wife, Mrs. Janie Burger. Two formidable people that stayed in town and was influential in the most part of the late 1880s, the beginning of the 19s, for 44 years. So this couple stayed in town and worked in the congregation for 44 years. Dominee Allewynburger, a unique person. He was responsible for building the church, but he was also responsible for the merging of the Nederduits Gereformeerde Kerk, what we know today, and the Nederduitse Hervormde Kerk. Now, if you have 10 Afrikaners present, you got 20 churches and 30 political parties, okay? So in this context, these two large churches decide to merge. And he was responsible to implement this merging of the churches in this region. His congregation was all the way from down here up to Polokwane, and he tried to visit the total congregation and try to preach all through the process there. And the interesting part is that he was sent up to Polokwane to go and relieve the preacher at that time in Polokwane or in Soutpansberg from his job, because he didn't preach this new merged church. And when he got just round about Groblersdal, an armed commando approached from Polokwane and said, "You don't touch our preacher. Turn around, go back." Afrikaner politics, okay? He established the first school in Middelburg, and then he became part of the commando. In his memoirs, he wrote that he visited General Piet Joubert in Pretoria just a week before the declaration of war, and Dr. Piet Joubert told him that he don't want war, but that he suggests that he goes back to his congregation and prepare for war. And that is exactly what he did. That Sunday, he preached war from the pulpit. Okay? Very interesting discussion there. He then joined the commando and accompanied the commando during its mobilizations, responsible for all the funerals in the field that we'll touch on just now, but also treating the wounded at numerous sites. He was then captured at Bottasberg in the Stoffberg area, where Duncan referred to, and sent to India as a prisoner of war with a lot of information on his capturing, the marching from Stoffberg all the way here to Middelburg, the joiners in Middelburg that stood around the streets and laughed at him as he was paraded from the station down to the center of town by the guards after he was captured. A very interesting person. After the war, he continued. He established the first orphanage in Middelburg that we'll touch on just now. And then he was responsible for the Lagersdrift community project. Now, there was a referral earlier to Mapochsgronde and what happened there. This area was created of small holdings for the people that couldn't afford proper farmer capabilities and participated in the Mapochs War. And he established capabilities at this facility and supported the poor. He was 44 years the minister of the church here. But he was supported by even more important Iron Lady. And that's why we placed her there at the back with the real trailblazers of Middelburg. And that is his wife, Mrs. Janie Burger. Mrs. Janie Burger was the granddaughter of President Boshoff of the Free State. Those of you that knows the history, the Moshes, the gunpowder plot, etc., etc. Her father was first the Treasury General of the Free State, then the Treasury General of the South Afrikaanse Republic. But importantly, she was educated at Unisie Girls High in Bloemfontein, so she spoke English fluently. And then she really got involved in the community in Middelburg. And she described vividly her experience when the first ladies arrived here as prisoners of war, how she went out to the station, how the one lady gave birth on one of the train trucks, how she died that same evening. She got involved in all of this, but as an English-speaking person and as a lady of that period of time, she really had guts. She walked up to General Ligthelm, who was the commander here, and said, "Get your horses out of my garden." And she insisted that he send somebody to come and take the horses that was eating her cabbage. So then she was sent to the concentration camp, to Howick. Interesting history there. But then she came back. She worked here in the orphanage, establishing the orphanage, taking charge of the orphans that was left here in the concentration camp after the war. She then collected money from the poor, impoverished Boer community to build a memorial hall for those that was killed in the concentration camp. She then continued and she established the South Afrikaanse Vrouwenfederasie as a welfare organization right here in Middelburg with all the activities that involved. In this house, this couple stayed. Harderwil, they practiced and they did their stuff here. And in this house, they receive, amongst others, Emily Hophouse. Emily Hophouse arrived here in 1903 after the war. She was received by Mrs. Burger in the house, and Emily Hophouse described how they were all sitting in the stuffy lounge on wooden upright chairs, and everybody wanted to tell her their experiences during the war. And she would rather sit on the veranda, but that wasn't acceptable. She was a guest and she had to sit in the lounge in the summer on an upright wooden chair. Interesting, the old reverend then accompanied Emily Hophouse and she went all the way down to Rusenekal that Duncan referred to earlier. Unfortunately, that is what is left of Harderwil and all the things that we just spoke about. If we then climb back into the tower and we now look into that direction through the little window on the side of the tower there, this is what we see. Luckily, on that side, there's still a jewel present. And if we zoom in, you could see that, the Carolus Trichardt house. Now, Duncan referred to Carolus earlier. After Carolus and his lovely wife, and we'll come to his lovely wife just now, moved into town, they stayed in this house right in the center of town, close to the church. Carolus was at that stage really old, but his wife is an interesting lady. I would not fight with her, very clear, okay? Mrs. Zacharia Geertruida Trichardt, okay? The two old people were left untouched by the British, and they stayed in the house. During the Boer War, they both unfortunately died in the house during this period of time and was buried in the cemetery that we'll hopefully visit on Thursday. If they look at the church, that is what they saw from their end. Church square that was used as a camping site for all the farmers coming into town for Holy Communion situations. If we get back into our tower and we look through the northern window of the church, this is what we see nowadays, the magistrate court. What was there before? Luckily, our clock turned backwards and we could see. That was the market square of Middelburg. And that was the center of town where all the market activities were taking place and all the farmers from the surrounding areas brought their produce for the market. And there was a market master from the local authority there to control the selling of pumpkins and everything else that the farmers brought in. However, if you look a little bit more, and that's another picture of the same site, there's a few interesting buildings visible there. To the left of the building is Burroughs' shop. The green roof there, very interesting building as well. But if you then look right across this market square, that appeared. And that was the first orphanage of Middelburg. When the Reverend Burger returned from India, he found that the concentration camp was slowly closing down, but there was at least 40 orphans left on the campsite. And he and old Commandant Piet Richard got together and they said that we cannot allow these children to be taken to Irene, which was the assembly point for all the orphans from all the concentration camps. We're going to keep them in town. So he approached the local bank manager, a Brit, and he applied on his personal security for a loan to buy this house. And the old Dominee bought the house and he established the house, and there was 40 orphans taken care of. That very suddenly increased to 96 orphans that they took care of in this building. You will hear tomorrow, unfortunately, that's what left there, just a set of flats, luckily marked with a blue heritage plaque. Unfortunately, nothing left of this orphanage. You will hear tomorrow in Karel's presentation on the other orphanage in Middelburg, the Excelda orphanage. This was only built in 1904 and is on a different site and not close to the White Church, but also, unfortunately, totally demolished. If we climb back into the tower and we peep through the next window, looking in the northeast direction over there, what can we see? This is what we see there today. Again, luckily, a little jewel still standing here at the bottom of the screen. But if you looked into that direction, you would have seen a building very similar to this. And this was the first Hervormde Kerk of Middelburg, a corrugated iron building. It didn't look exactly the same. We don't have a picture of this building, but it looks similar to this. And this was made available by the Hervormde Kerk as the first school in Middelburg. And the first schoolmaster, H. van der Linden, was teaching in this school at a salary of £150 per year, and he was responsible as the head teacher and only teacher of the school. Another tragic person, and you'll pick up in my presentation that there's a few tragic people. We don't even know what his first name was. He was just known as Mr. van der Linden, the school teacher. He unfortunately died here in town and is buried in the cemetery and marked with a blue heritage plaque as well. But then coming back to this house, still standing, the white Kesting, the Kok house, a very interesting house, one of the first houses sold by the Dutch Reformed Church, by Dominee Burger. Interesting aspects there. Dominee Burger bought the house from the church for £5 and he sold it to Kesting the next day for £100. So we think it was just a way of getting the transfer, but that's an interesting part there. Then White moved into this house. He had a shop in town. But then it was bought by a very interesting lady called Lily de Kok and her husband. Now, her husband, I wouldn't call her oil painting ladies. I don't know what you think about him. But she was his second wife. And they stayed together in this house. But they had a prenuptial agreement that if she passed away, he will give her £1,000. Unfortunately, she died before him, so he decided to donate the money to the church. And the church, that's his shop right in town, and you could see there he was a direct importer into the businesses in Middelburg, but the church bought a new church organ with the money. And it is this church organ which was considered to be the biggest and most modern instrument at its time that you will hear tonight played in the church in memory of his wife, Lily. We climb back into our tower and we now peep into the eastern direction through our time window. This is what we see there today, the High Court of Middelburg. Still a very historical building, a very impressive building, but there was another building there before time, and that was the government building of the Suid-Afrikaanse Republic. Same site, opened in 1888 by Paul Kruger, interesting enough, on the 26th of December. So he must have traveled on Christmas Day to be in Middelburg to open this office building. It housed the courthouse, it housed the post office, and during the war, it was used as the British center for the town. And you read in quite a few of the ladies' descriptions in town of the horrible, cruel, Waterfield, Major Waterfield, that was the administrator in this building of the town. And he made the decisions of who goes to the concentration camp and who's not going to the concentration camp. Major Waterfield, an interesting character. But there's also tragedy there. And there was a little guy working in the courthouse called Willem Frederik Sebastian Kirsten, and he was married. He had 9 children. His wife then died. He remarried. His son died again, and he was extremely depressed. And he walked out of town into the Arsenal building that we'll talk about later and show you, and commit suicide. Tragic character. In his estate, however, there's a large amount of money that had to be paid back to the court, so to the government. So we think he may have had his fingers in the till. We're not sure about that. Tragic character. Unfortunately, the building burned down, and in 1908, the building burned down, and luckily more effective than current, in the year thereafter, a new building was built on the spot, which housed first the magistrate office and now the High Court, opened in 1908. Very effective administration for the period of time to build such a building so quickly. That's what it looks like. It houses currently the High Court. It was previously the Magistrate Court and the Post Office. Climbing back into our tower again, and we can now peep out of the window into the southeast direction, and that is what we see, a center part of town. Luckily, through our time window, we can distinguish what this looked like before. And this is what this main street of Middelburg, with its shops right opposite the church, looked like in that period of time. And you could see this picture was taken during the British occupation of the town that we'll touch on in a few seconds' time. Right here at the end, you can see the part of a building sticking out. There's my grand pointer coming. Here's the building sticking out. If we go to that building, that's what the church looked like from their side. And there was Crocker, the direct importer, very important business in Middelburg for many, many years, and a part of the heritage of Middelburg. Now, I know previous speaker spoke about the nutter and the supper. Now, the supper's office was right here at the end of this building. And there was quite a few incidents where the nutters were throwing things at the supper's political office right here in the building there. What does it look like today, Andele? Nothing left, unfortunately, a modern hospital on the spot. If we continue our trip through the church, and we come into the next windows of the church, and we peep out into the southern direction of the church and look into the history of the buildings, that is what we can see in that direction. A square, originally called the Church Square, then Rood Square, then Van Blaert Square, the same square, unfortunately, right in front of the church there. This is what it looked like in the days that we're speaking about. The church square, the camping area of the hospital, of the farmers in front of the church, and this painting by Kutzer in 1938 is a unique representation of what the church looked like. If you look to the area there, you could see the rectory that we just spoke about. If you look over there, you could see the house of Trichard that we just spoke about. We can see Burroughs' shop, and right the opposite side, where's the pointer going? Sorry. You could see right there the orphanage building. A very unique painting, currently in the art gallery of Durban in a storeroom. We tried our best to convince the art gallery of Durban that it will be on exhibit in Middelburg. They are unfortunately not interested. But right in the middle of the square stands a little monument called the Burger Monument, and it was built in 1938 in the sphere of the time in the national development in the country. And you see there it commemorates not only the symbolic Oxwagon Trail or the centenary of the Great Track, but also those that died in the first or the second Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War, coincidentally used on the same site. So this building, this little monument there, was inaugurated in 1938 in a unique ceremony. You could see an arch built right in front of the court building that we showed you earlier. You could see Crocker's building right there at the back, and you could see to the right-hand side of this arch the important Imperial Hotel, which was one of the main accommodations in Middelburg and a very unique building. This is the committee that organized that centenary. How the hell they got so many Afrikaners together to agree on how to do it, I don't know. So this must have been a very interesting discussions on this meeting, but they unveiled this monument, and as in so many towns in the country, there was some cement used, and the wagon and oxen was pulled over it, and you could see here at the bottom the oxen hooves and the tracks, and you could see at the top the 1952 version where the Van Riebeeck Festival was commemorated, and they were pulling the postal coach or the stagecoach and the horses over the area over there. Lots of drives currently in Middelburg to move this monument to a more accessible position. Coming back to what Andele said, I think we should think about development of the total area. This little monument was used for several festivals and commemorations. And then the other side of this monument. And this brings us to another very interesting part of the history of Middelburg. And that is the commemoration of the members of the Middelburg Commando that died during the Anglo-Boer War. Actively involved in the process. In 1899, the history of Middelburg changed. We just commemorated 2 days ago the ultimatum and then the start of the war, and this made a massive change in Middelburg. We had an active era of very positive propaganda in town.
Koor van Torfontein sing die Transvaalse volkslied.
We had Dominee Burger preaching from the pulpit that we will win this war with God on our side. We had the magistrate telling Dominee Burger, this is going to be a 3 weeks experience and we will sort this out. And when they indicated, and Burger wrote this, that if we can't stop the British at the ports, we will not be able to win this war, he was considered a coward. The leaders of the town now moved over from their role as leaders in town to members of the commando, and we see Piet Minnaar here on his horse as he deployed to the commando. Unfortunately, the Middelburg Commando mobilized at the railway station. They moved to Zandspruit. They participated in the first battles, and unfortunately, quite a few of the people on this picture we know is going to die. Right here in the front, you just get the pointer going, sorry. Okay, let me go to this one. Right here in the front sits Japie Skabort, one of the young guys that's going to be killed. Next to him sits Japie Maree, that's grave we will tomorrow or Wednesday visit in the cemetery. Tragic situation. More of these black framed messages arrived in town, and it was the responsibility of the coster to inform everybody in town when will the next funeral take place. Again, the church become a central portion of this activities. And the congregation gathered in the church, and quite frequently this piece of music was heard. More and more of these pews were empty as civilian ladies and children were sent off to the concentration camps, and the burghers were in commando and died. This vehicle appeared frequently in front of the church. And we're starting to see these scenes in the cemetery that we will visit. This is a British military funeral in the cemetery. You could see the British camp at the back there, and then the new heaps appeared. Philip Bronkhorst killed at Brugspruit. Japie Maree wounded at Stoffberg and taken to Machadodorp, where his arm got septic. Arm was amputated, sepsis spread, died in the hospital in Machadodorp. But there's also the more positive part to this. Another person in Middelburg, Jacobus Turin, had a stationery shop in town, and he picked up a tune he met Sari Maree, and they got married. And after he picked up the tune of Sweet Ellery, he composed allegedly the words of Sari Maree, at least two of the verses of the well-known song. He stayed in Middelburg and died in Middelburg, and he's buried in the cemetery here. Positive part, unfortunately, he had two daughters, 20 years and 28 years old, that died as well and is buried in unmarked graves in the cemetery. Then happens the next step. On the 27th of July, 1900, Middelburg got invaded. The forces entered Middelburg past the current hospital. They moved around the church and they assembled in front of that same building that I showed you earlier, the court building of the town. Van Woudenberg, 26 years old, the acting magistrate, handed the keys over to General French and General Hamilton that was here, and the ceremony was conducted in front of the building. Middelburg was under British rule. The church became a British church. It was not used for any other purpose. It was also not plundered. It was used by the Brits on every Sunday. The local congregation got permission to use it from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock. And after 10 o'clock, it was used by the Brits. And you could see the church parades in front of the church. Another picture of the church parades a little bit later. But look right between the trees and the church. And you could see this is after November of that year. And then onwards, the movement in October 1901, when the concentration camp was moved to the site opposite the river. So this picture was definitely taken after October 1901, and you could see the concentration camp, the total area on the hill opposite the river. This camp functioned all the time through till January 1903. So back to our square and what it looks like today. But if we look across the square, Rood Square, Van Blair Square, that's what it looked like during the time. And then in 1907, it was used by the cadets. Very interesting. We were not aware of that, Professor Frans Johan, that there was a very active drive to create cadet companies in all the schools. And this was Middelburg's cadet company, the 57th company of cadets, under the leadership of the headmaster, Mr. Clegg. And you could see, if you look into the picture, some of them are primary school kids, and they were taken on shooting exercises, etc., by the Brits. So interesting, the cadets in town. In 1910, right there in the middle of the square, some trees were planted to commemorate the Union of South Africa. And there's a tree for every province. Unfortunately, the Natal tree was hit by lightning, so it's an indication to Natal, but it was replanted, and there are 4 oak trees there, unfortunately, currently in a very bad state and need urgent attention. But if you look right across the square, the last interesting building, or the second last interesting building, pops up. And that's the current Astra building. For the older people in Middelburg, that was the Bioscope in our days, okay? But if you rip down the front part of that building, it's just a facade in the front. Behind it, you find that. And that was the first town hall of Middelburg, a private hall built by Boshoff and de Kok. You remember de Kok from the shop earlier? And this was commissioned, completed in 1899, as you could see above the doorway, and commissioned by the Brits. But before that, it was used by the Boers. And if you go again, and the colleagues are here with the detail, that Roberts have decided to send the women and children to the commandos. And in July, Roberts sent this women and children from Pretoria to Van der Merwe station, and from there they were brought to Middelburg, and they were housed in this hall. Then the Brits commissioned it, and when Middelburg Commando was apprehended at Stoffberg, Bossie, the Middelburg Commando members that was captured was marched into town. They had to march from the station with guards on their sides all the way to this hall, and they were accommodated in this hall before they were sent off to Pretoria and then off to India. And Dominee Burger describes how he sits in this hall, he looks through the door, he could see his church, he could hear the congregation singing, but he's not allowed to go there at all. Interesting building and an integral part of Middelburg, standing still behind that facade. Then climbing back into the tower and peeping through our last time window into the west and the southwest of Middelburg. This is what we see. A shopping mall on Dele. Again, nothing left of what was there before. If we use the time window, this is what the same spot looked like in the days. Interesting buildings right there. To the right-hand side, the red brick building, and I'm coming back to that just now, the famous Blake House. And we'll spend a few minutes on Blake House just now. But let's just look up the street, and you could see some other interesting buildings there. Please remember this house, and I think there's another picture of it, and Jack Hinden's wife. The printing works of Fruin. Then up here, the shops that we showed you earlier. And there's those shops in perspective with Blake House right at the end here. The printing works of H.O. Fruin right here. The Cox shop over here. And these two buildings. The famous laver from Highbury Hall's Southampton house and his shop. So those two buildings were the shops of Mr. Laver that we spoke about earlier. And then came an interesting period of time. And in 1902, look what that same shop suddenly looks like in August 1902 for the coronation of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. And it's described how the gramophone was standing in the front of his shop and it was celebrating the coronation. The hope and glory of the free. How can we extol thee, who are born of thee? Interesting that at that stage, the concentration camp was still functioning. There was still a large number of women and children in the concentration camp, and it would have been very interesting to know what was the sentiment in town to the celebrations of the coronation of the new king and the pro-British attitude taken by the shop owners. Back to Blake House. Very interesting building, built by a guy called Robert Blake. He was a cattle merchant from Cape Town. How he built this building in Middelburg, nobody knows. Why he built this building in Middelburg, nobody knows. Okay? But he built it and he died in 1901. And his wife, Anna Susanna Blake, inherited the building. We don't have any idea of what was her link with Middelburg or anybody in Middelburg. But that takes us to two other characters involved in the trains around Middelburg, and that was Jack Hinden and Henry Slegkamp. Jack Hinden, the explosive, Slegkamp, the trigger for all the rail destructions in the area. However, after the war, Hinden was pardoned by Kitchener, and there's a quite well described scene there where he was pardoned by Kitchener. He then went on to join the circus in America, the well-called Boer Circus in America. And very interesting, the dynamic Hinden was in the circus, the adjutant of Cronje that surrendered at Paardeberg. So it would have been an interesting combination, Hinden, the go-getter, Cronje, Professor Frans Johan, the dead duck, or what shall I call him, in this regard, but Hinden, his adjutant in the circus. Unfortunately, things didn't go well. Hinden came back, and Anna Susanna Skeepers, Blyk, gave this building, made this building available to Hinden to operate as a boarding house. He then developed motor neuron disease. He became paralyzed. He was in a wheelchair, and his wife is standing with him, Pauline Hinden, and they operated this house as a boarding house. So this was their income in life until 1919, when he fell out of the wheelchair, was in a lot of pain. The Vrouwenfederatie collected money. They sent him to the Zuid-Afrikaanse hospital in Pretoria, the local Boerehospitaal on that stage, for an operation. And unfortunately, he died on the operating table. So, tragic story. If you really want to read tragedy, please look at his estate. He had a total amount of £7 in his estate. And he, in his will, he gave back the building to Anna Susanna Blyk because it was her building. But he then handed out his possessions. One pen, a picture of the Free State coat of arms, and his dog. Tragic character. What happened to his fellow colleague, Henry Slegkamp? Bit more positive news. He stayed on in town, become a well-known resident in town, but then, as Professor Frans Johan referred to earlier, become a leader in the Ossewa Brandwag. He stayed in his little house down at the end just before the cemetery, and his house is marked with a blue plaque. You may have picked up some stories about another character, and I will talk tomorrow about the importance on the blue plaques to do proper research and listen not only to family stories, and you're going to pick up a story of another individual, John Tower Blyk. Now, his family has published this, that he built this house, his building, for Jack Hinden's widow, etc., etc. The building was built long before the war, and unfortunately, John Tower Blyk was never involved in this process. His family claims a lot of credit, but he remains a very interesting character. He was wounded, not in the Anglo-Boer War, but in the Battle of Gettysburg, in the American Civil War. Okay? He thereafter studied medicine, came to South Africa, had a practice at numerous spots, practice in Zeerust, where he created a hospital in the Freemasons Lodge on Zeerust, but he was also a horse breeder. And the story is, and this is again part of the family history, that he was sitting in the lounge on his farm just outside Zeerust when the Brits arrived, and they say they here to commandeer all his horses. And he told his wife to show hospitality to the Brits, gave them some tea while he just went outside. And then they just hear shots. And he came back and he said, you can have them all now, they're all dead outside. So he walked out and he shot all his horses. Interesting character. Unfortunately, that's what's left of that street and all the history that was in that street. Our church, that we took you now into the time window and took you through the process. Unfortunately, there is very little left of these good memories, and luckily we can return to reality and the church as it looks today. Thank you for a trip through history.